All right, over to you.
Great. Thanks for the intro, Donald. So James Cannon's my name. I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so going through slides. Going to give you some highlights on, how I've grown my own career remotely. I'm currently based out of Wexford, as I mentioned in the chat. I've been working remote for over 10 years now, a mix of startups and more large, primarily American corporate firms. And really just kind of some tips and tricks and some insights into what's been successful for me, and hopefully that can be useful for everybody else as well. So a bit about me. I'm a strategic advisor on governance and compliance at Novartis. Novartis is currently, I believe, we're the largest pharma company in the world. As part of that work, I lead quality, trust, and safety at the Pharma Ledger Foundation. Pharma Ledger Foundation is a not-for-profit enterprise that brings pharmaceutical companies together along with patients to build technology that is very patient-centric. I also do a lot of advisory work. I'm a board member at ICANN, PTI. We are the organization that coordinates domain names. So we make sure that when you enter google.com into your browser, it's going to the right place. Previously, I've worked at Novartis 3 times. I seem to like the place. I've also been Chief Information Security Officer at a startup called LifeGen. And prior to that, I've also worked with the United Nations, Amgen, Pfizer, and as a consultant. I have a TikTok cycle that I like to talk about, where I do startups for 3 years, and then I do big corporate for 3 years, and then I go back to startups. Essentially, everything that you see on the screen here, apart from my United Nations role, has been remote, either full-time or 70, 80% remote. And really, it's about how do you do that? I think a lot of people have been exposed to the concept of work from home and remote working since the pandemic. It's a concept that's obviously been around for a lot longer than that, particularly within the tech industry, but it's really now something that's been thrust into the mindsets of just normal workers. People are now have this whole extra dimension of their work concept. And it's really important to look at the differences between a normal office-based job and how you kind of grow and succeed in that ecosystem and that environment versus how you can grow and succeed in a remote culture. And really, for me, it comes down to 3 things. These are kind of my 3 principles of remote success. It's about communication, it's about trust, and it's about documentation. So really, with these 3 kind of culture pillars, you as a worker and you as somebody who wants to grow in a remote environment, these are the ways that you can build yourself for success and are able to really put yourself out there as somebody who can not just work in a remote environment, because I think that's what a lot of people are doing already. We've been forced into this work from home situation because of COVID. But there's a difference between just existing within an environment that was imposed upon you versus choosing to really change your outlook on certain things so that you can really succeed within that ecosystem. So looking at communications first, being excellent at communications is the #1 thing to being very successful as a remote worker. So everything you do when we're remote working it's founded on an ability to be able to communicate your needs, your solutions, and being able to promote yourself as an exceptional performer. This goes for whether you're working in a large corporation or in a small business. For the Irish, this can be a double-edged sword, I found personally. We are fantastic at small talk. We're really great at having chats about things. We're also usually able to convert that into quite easily be able to communicate in meetings. And we're, often very open on talking about challenges. But we also are terrible at celebrating our successes. And one thing that we really need to be able to wrap our head around when you're communicating is you don't necessarily have that kind of coffee room, meeting room, lunchroom ability to say, oh yeah, and I did great on this thing and I did great on this thing, or you won't necessarily have that instant feedback that you get in an office environment. So this can be very challenging to not necessarily be able to focus on how you're doing well. We're great at being able to work through things, but particularly when it gets to being able to succeed in being promoted and going up the ladder, that can be a challenge for Irish people sometimes. Using your communication skills to your advantage, like nobody has ever grown a remote career by keeping their heads down. Growing up, my father always told me, go into work and keep your head down and just work. That's great in an office environment. It does not work in a remote culture. You are almost entirely reliant on your peer groups and other folks around you supporting you and agreeing that you're the best candidate for that next step up on the ladder. And you really have to not be afraid to indicate your preference for promotion. You need to really put yourself out there that, yes, I am the person that wants to go to that next ladder, or I want to go on that project. I want to be able to show my success here. You have to be open and, very honest in that communication in a remote environment. When you do good work, you need to call that out. If you're in a leadership role, you need to create a space where your staff feel comfortable doing that. As a people manager, my remote staff, I have a session a week of 30 minutes where the only thing we do is talk about what worked really well this week. What did you succeed at? Because again, you need to have that space and you need to be able to foster that culture of showing what you're doing well. Also being able to ask for help. That can be a very important thing as well. But really from a career growth perspective, you need to be able to push that out there that, this is how I've done well and here's what my next steps are going to be. Another good thing to think about from a communication perspective is learn how to give great talks. I've started speaking more externally over the last few years, so I'm still kind of getting into my stride with it. But it's being able to, again, come back to that thing of being able to project. You need to be able to project in a remote environment on how you are able to show your value. And skills of good presentation design, construction, these are new critical skills that will help you stand out from the crowd. And I think people that are able to latch onto that and are able to adopt that mindset will be the ones that are really called upon to step up into those next roles. Often when we're in global teams as well, this is something I think the Irish have a big advantage on, and it's certainly something that I've been called on in my career to kind of help others with often, is we often work in intercultural teams. I think the Irish are great at that. I think it's something that we adopt onto very well. The nuances of I'm dealing with people from Asia, I'm dealing with people from the US, and that kind of open, easygoing attitude is super useful. Again, being able to bring that into your remote career can be a big value add, and it can be really a way to call out your ability to coalesce these teams together and build that kind of healthy working atmosphere within a remote team. The second pillar is building for trust. So your trust networks when you're within a remote environment are absolutely critical. Your trust networks are the people that are going to help you build your career. This is a mix of direct reports, it's a mix of your peers, it's a mix of your managers, and you'll need all three to be able to have that trust in you to be able to succeed and progress in your career. Remote first cultures are often very democratic. Promotion decisions are often taken by panels of reviewers rather than by single managers. In a normal office environment, often it's your manager plus HR and budget. In remote cultures that I've experienced, often you have a more team-based promotion culture. And you might have 3 or 4 people that look at your promotion application to see, is this, the right candidate for this role? And that's where this plays into that strategy of building up those trust networks. Who might be on those panels? Do they have that trusted relationship with you where they will speak out in support of your promotion? My anecdotal experiences, those are at their core helpful and friendly within their work environment. Those who are the ones to kind of put their hand up and say, oh yeah, I'll help you with that, or no, I know something about that, I'll be able to give you a hand though there. Those are the ones that build trust fastest. Doesn't mean that you're an imperfect employee. It's not about putting on a false face. It's about being authentic to yourself and really putting yourself out there as that person who can be relied on. Another thing that's very important to me is similar to what I've just been mentioning about, don't put yourself out there as a perfect employee. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Trust goes both ways. And being able to say, nope, don't know about that one either. I need to put you in touch with this other person, or, I don't know about that one. I need to go off and do some research. That ability to be able to be confident in what you don't know is very critical in remote careers. People will take you on face value. And if you're unable to deliver on what you say you're going to, there isn't as much of a space to kind of have that failure if you have said you're not, you are able to do something and then you don't deliver on it. The culture that is in remote careers is often very merit based, and it's often very evidence based. It's can be less political than the office environments that we may be used to before, where it's more about on who and what connection you have with this person. It's more about the evidence that you are able to deliver. Then you have that kind of support and trust layer on top of it to be able to take that evidence and bring it up into career growth. This then comes into my last pillar, which is documentation. Documentation is super, super critical. So without having some way to document your progress and document, what you're working on and, your successes and the things that you're having challenges with, your ability to kind of track, prove, and give examples when it comes to those promotion cycles, it'll be seriously hampered. Documentation can take many forms. It can be as simple as a task list, that you keep on a pad of paper. It can go right up into, complex performance management and note-taking strategies and, very elaborate ways of tracking your work and what you're doing and your successes and your evidence of what you have contributed to the company. I think that anybody working in a remote first culture should be able to answer from like a written set of notes the following kinds of questions. How did you do that? That's your process management documentation. Having something that is there and repeatable, and you are the person that knows what that process is and the nuances of it, super, super important. What decision did we take at that meeting? Minutes, note taking. These are, all old school things we likely learned at some stage in business studies. Again, they come back and become very important in a remote first culture. Why did we have that meeting? What did we talk about? What were the outcomes? What were the decisions? And who took ownership of certain tasks? Again, very, very important in a remote culture. What's on your plate this week? What are you working on? Task management. Often in remote cultures, it can be very difficult to get that balance of what is my capacity. Your capacity in a office-based job is based on when you're in the office. I arrive at 9, I leave at 5. That is my working hours. We've seen a lot in COVID times with people being pushed into work from home situations. Their concept of work-life balance has seemingly gone one of two ways, I've noticed. Either people have really embraced it and got a really good work-life balance, or people are working 14, 16 hours a day. That capacity management is, again, a super important piece of being able to be successful as a remote employee. And then big picture, what's your plan? Again, in office scenarios, you can often come into more of a railroad track where, you come in and you're working on this. I've often found in remote first cultures in particular, as opposed to hybrid cultures, it's often a lot more open. It's often more employee driven rather than management driven. So again, having that strategy management piece, what am I working on for this month? What's the goal that I'm working on for my team for the next quarter? What's the goal for the team for the next year? Particularly as you start to go into management roles and become a people manager, this becomes super important, being able to document all of these things. It's great having all of this in our heads. And when you're able to chat about it in an office, that's one thing. But, if my team wants to know what our goals are for this quarter, it's there on a wiki page. They're able to look at that at any point, because they may not have the opportunity to have a coffee chat with me and double check on something. So, having this extensive documentation is something that's super important for me. The last thing, it's not one of my pillars, but it's something that, particularly as people start to transition from work from home to remote, equip yourself with the right tools. You'll see, I've quite a background behind me. I have a dedicated home office. If you're going to be in a hybrid scenario, you may not need that. But if you want to be a remote first employee, I would think about, when you are in an office, you will think about, do I have a reliable car that gets me to work? Do I have a business suit that's suitable for the corporate environment that I work in? From a remote position, think about the same things. Do I have a home office that I can go to that I work in? Do I have the right tools and equipment to actually enable me to be very credible and project authority within that remote environment? I was talking with Donald just before we started. I have a small TV studio around me. So you can't see it because I hide it all from the camera. But, I have 4 lights. I have 5 screens. I have a complex DSLR camera. It's about, again, having those tools to project that you are a very confident remote working employee. It's a space that projects, I know what I'm doing here. I'm a very strong remote worker, and excellent audio video equipment. Like, I keep everything off camera, but you can see, I have audio equipment. Again, I have a extensive video equipment set up. I can do complex presentations. I can live stream from this platform if I'm going to do something that's more public. Having these tools can be very important. Doesn't need to be expensive. I would say I've invested, quote unquote, a lot of money into my setup, but it's still maybe 1,000, 1,500 euros worth of investment. So really, it's about, investing into your remote career in the same way that you'd invest into the things that would get you to the office and make you appear credible in an office scenario. So really, that's kind of the quick overview, and I'm looking forward to questions. A personal thing for me, this is my work mantra is stay hungry, stay foolish, which is a Steve Jobs quote, which I really like. Be willing to take the risks. I think there's a big culture change happening right now. I think COVID has changed how we look at work and look at the positioning of work. I've been working from home offices for 10 years. I would never go back. And if I hadn't taken that, risk 10 years ago to move into those remote roles, I wouldn't be able to be here and giving you guys some advice. So, take the risks when it makes sense, and be a little bit foolish, and hopefully it will pay off in the long term. So that's my last slide. We'll stop sharing now, and then I think we can move on to the questions and answers. And I will share these slides and my contact details on the Slack after the session. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much,
over
James.
to Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. There's so much in there, and I think that'll lead to a really nice discussion of a lot of the topics. And I love how you've broken it into the 3 pillars. So there's first question actually came up, but I'll invite everybody to pop a question in the chat box there. Kevin says, great insights, James. Keep your comments coming, keep your questions coming. I've taken some notes there for anybody, just in case you missed any of it, and we'll use these as sort of minutes of our own call. So it's always good to document. Number 3, document. Before I go to John Evoy, he's got his hand up there. Got a question. Was Novartis in the news? Did it sell in Cork today? Ken asks. James, do you know anything about that?
I will not comment on that.
Okay, right.
Yes, but I'm not going to go beyond that. Yes, there is stuff in the news, and I will say personally, not speaking on behalf of Novartis, I think it was the best outcome of a difficult situation.
Okay.
People are keeping their jobs. That's the main thing I'll say.
Good news. Thanks a million, James. Okay, so I'm going to actually ask John if you want to unmute. I can add your spotlight here.
Yeah, thanks a million, Donald, and thanks, James. Brilliant. And it was good listening throughout, but I particularly pricked up my ears there about the setup you have there, because obviously when we're at this side of the screen, you don't notice that. You just see somebody's coming across, but you do notice when somebody's not great. If they're looking down, like I have my camera here, I have to look down at it or whatever, or or the lighting is not great, or particularly different times throughout the day. The sun coming in through the window makes a huge difference. It can be blinding me or whatever. I'd love to know more about that. Maybe now is not the time, but even particular advice around what type of camera, what type of lighting and all. I don't know how much of the time we want to take up talking about that, but I find that fascinating, and definitely I'm going to make some improvements after listening to it.
Yeah, no, and So what's easier? I think I'll make a suggestion to the Grow Remote team. So yeah, like audiovisual in particular is super important. You know, as you said, it projects, and maybe what would be a good idea, like you can start off with a minimal investment and get good results out of it. You know, you can start off by putting, I would say, 150 euro into your AV and get a marked step change. So maybe what we could do is even set up a Slack channel. I think most of the folks should be on the Slack, where, you know, I'm happy to, you know, if people say, give me a budget, and I'll say, here's what I would recommend for that budget. I'll write up, I have a copy paste somewhere of everything that I have here. You know, my setup is extensive. You know, I can literally stream to RTE from this piece of kit. Not everybody needs that. You know, it's a bit of a hobby for me as well. But the core of put some money into it and make that investment, I think anybody who is looking for, you know, either a strong hybrid where you're going to be, you know, 3 days a week from home, or a full remote career, it is something you should have a serious think about putting some money into. You know, I said to Donald before we all started, you know, if I live in Wexford, if my corporate job was in the Dublin office, right, I am not going to have a 200 euro car. I'm going to have something that's reliable and gets me into the office. I'm also not going to show up to the office in my pajamas. I'm going to, most likely for my role, I'm probably going to have a suit, right? I will buy a good suit. You need to think about it from the same perspective. If you're full-time work from home, some of that money that you might have spent on the more reliable car, or, you know, the good office clothes, put that into your audiovisual setup. And, you know, that can scale depending on the stage of your career and how much disposable income you have available to put into that. But again, think about it in the same thing. It's an investment in your career.
That's great. Yeah. And it's something that, although it's not as deep, or as, you know, it's not the hard skills that you're talking about, you know, in your 3 pillars, but it's all about first impression, and it's about that trust, and it's about that, it's almost a soft skill. It's strangely, yeah. You know, it's something that it can have a big impression on someone, even though you're not speaking, or even though it's in the background. And I suppose that's why it's something that does stay with us. And I suppose as remote workers, as people hoping to build their remote careers, it is something that is worth considering at whatever level or whatever stage you're at, and what you want to do. We've got a question as well, Kristen. It's a question about feedback, and I know you were talking about communication. So maybe, James, you could take us through an approach, or a few approaches of how should I ask for feedback when I'm remote. And say, let's take 2 examples. Maybe one is where it's hybrid and I'm at home, but I know that my other colleagues are actually in the office, and they've got that one-to-one FaceTime. They're bumping into the manager. They're getting that more, the feedback in the corridor and things like that. So how can I come across that? And then also maybe in a fully remote first environment, there are tools, there are approaches, there are methodologies that are really useful. So maybe you can just introduce a few ideas.
So let's talk about the hybrid scenario first, because I think that's what a lot of people are going to be encountering. You know, if you're in a hybrid scenario and you feel that you don't have that space to really get that 2-way communication going with your management, really set out quite honestly with your manager what your expectations are. You know, because it's really about getting to that parity with your office-based colleagues. You know, if you know from experience, for example, that at least once a month they're sitting down and having that coffee conversation on, you know, how they're doing with the management, with your manager, ask for the same parity and be really open and honest with it. Say, I'd like to set aside a 45-minute section, you know, once a month to talk about progress and feedback and career development. You know, if your manager pushes back on that, ask them what would work for them. Because really you need to set up that expectation first. And particularly if they're a manager who's maybe might be more new to managing remote employees, it can be a bit of a culture shock for them as well. Because with a remote, you know, as a remote people manager, there's a lot more work in it. I will say that, you know, it's not as easy as when you have office-based employees and you're just there and you can have more ad hoc things. You need to set out that expectation of structure and bring it to them as a structured conversation is the other point, actually, I'd put it. Pick out, let's take the example of a 45-minute meeting, right, that you're going to have once a month. Bring your manager 3 topics that you'd like feedback on. Structure that whichever way you want. You know, if you feel like you had a bad month, bring them 3 things that you think didn't go well and you want advice on what really should I have done here, or, you know, I didn't like this, you know, what happened there. Or if you had a particularly good month, bring them 3 things that you felt really went well, and kind of fact checked your own assumptions on, did these actually go well? And you're then setting up that cycle. You know, it might take 2 or 3 months of those, and then your manager might actually start sliding into, oh, and by the way, yeah, I'd like to add this one. You know, I've noticed that this went well this month. Because once you get into that rhythm, it's about setting up those kind of almost subconscious processes by forcing them a little bit at the start, but then they become more natural over time. Then very quickly on the fully remote one, within a fully remote first culture, really HR should be providing some tool sets for that. You know, your goals and your strategy and what you're expected to perform against should be, again, documented, and you should have methods to track against that. You know, there's a lot of tools out there. I won't go into which ones I personally like or don't like, but again, that is really something, and particularly if anybody's thinking of building a remote first company here, you know, that's a strategic investment. You need to have that to ensure that, you know, from CEO down to brand new employee, everybody is aligned on, here is company strategy, here is department strategy, here is goals, and here is how I track against those goals. Asynchronous working, remote first, all of these need structure. You know, I think a lot of people think, oh, you know, cool tech companies, remote, everything is very, you know, blasé and ad hoc and all of it. No, remote needs way more strategy than an office-based job. You know, humans, we have a lot of strategy when we sit together in person. You know, we have these natural ways to organize. That's not as strong when we're remote. So you do need to put structure around successful remote companies. Look at particularly GitLab. So GitLab is a remote first tech company. They have a handbook that is actually public that anybody can read, which is how they run their company. It is absolutely invaluable. The GitLab handbook is a playbook essentially on how to build and operate and succeed within a remote first culture. It's an amazing resource that people should look at.
Thanks a million, James. And I'm going to try and find that. I think I see the link here. I'll post that. I just wanted to take you up on something there. You said earlier, and you probably just contextualize it there. You said remote management is more work or takes more work. And I suppose what you're saying is it takes it more structure because things are async and because the systems are very different. But maybe rather than saying that it's harder or takes more work, maybe it's very different. And in a hybrid sort of scenario where actually managers are trained and probably have most experience in office-based management, for those managers, it does take a lot more work because they have to relearn or apply lots more learning and structure in a context that they're sort of their feet in both. You know what I mean? The feet in both doors. And so it's for people who in remote first, they would be training themselves like yourself over the last 10 years to work in a particular way. And therefore, you know how to do it. And there are best ways of doing that. So maybe it's not that it's more work, that you can be efficient as a remote manager or as a remote employee, but it's in this transitional period that we're in where people are moving into remote or moving into hybrid that actually it seems like it's very complicated and it seems like it's more work.
Yeah, and it's a good point to rephrase. I don't think it's necessarily more work. I think it's a very different way of approaching things. I think when you're in an office, you have a culture that builds organically, right? You have a group of people, they come together and they organically work out what the culture is between them. When you're a people manager, particularly if you're setting up something new in a remote or hybrid environment as well, you need to put effort into building that culture. You know, that's more the core of what I was trying to say is more, you need to have that investment from management and put that in. You know, you can't just kind of expect the same thing to happen in a remote culture that would have happened in the office. Doesn't necessarily mean it's more time or it's additional effort. You know, it's just more, it's a different type of effort that you have to put in, because you're going to get savings in other areas. So like, you know, it shouldn't be additional hours on your workday type of thing, but it is just something that you do have to actually kind of pay attention to.
Yeah. And this goes for every single element of it. It's not just management. It just getting this, even confidence can be the thing that holds you back at the beginning, but just learning, like you said, if you invest in a webcam, if you invest in a project management tool that, you know, like for instance, getting to know Slack really, really well before you do an interview, so that you have the confidence to say, yeah, I've been using Slack with Grow Remote, or, you know, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And that shows that you're willing to learn, you're able to learn. And this is something that comes up a lot in our jobs club. This attitude can be the most important thing, or maybe, you know, 51% over like the competency and the skills, the attitude to be able to adapt and to be able to learn, because all these tools, all these platforms are changing all the time. It's such a fast moving world we live in, and especially if you're working 100% remote.
Yep. Agreed. Remote is a very dynamic environment. You know, you could almost have it akin to, you know, you're changing the office location and the tools that you're doing on a yearly basis, you know, because when you're remote first, you have the ability to move a lot quicker, you know, and if something comes onto the radar and you're able to adopt that tool or that, you know, way of working in a remote first culture, your ability to actually adopt that quickly and embed it into your ways of working in your corporate environment is 10x what it is with a more traditional company culture.
Yeah, good stuff. So we're going to finish up in about 8 minutes or so, guys. So any questions you have, please do put them into the chat box. I'm also just sharing a link here to a quick survey just to let us know how this evening's event was for you. So I'll leave out there for the next few minutes and just click in and you can type in. But one thing I want to ask James is actually about these tools. Like you're saying, things are so fast moving. So maybe can you give us your top 2 or 3 tools that have been really like critical to your success and even critical to how you get your work done? And maybe this is something that people can go away and look into, you know, doing a tutorial on YouTube or actually, you know, downloading something for the first time and really getting into it. Because if you master like some of these key platforms or key tools, it can transform your whole remote career.
Yep. So very easily. So I've done too much research on this over the years. So culminating probably, I would say, at least 5 years of using different tools and looking at different things. I've settled on 2 for me personally. So I use Remnote, or Remnote, and I use Remnote as my notebook, right? So that's where I put all of my scratchpad notes that I would, you know, previously put into a Moleskine journal or an A4 scratch cap. You know, it has some great features around linking between your notes, and I use it as a daily journal. I noticed, who was it? Kristen, you know, you mentioned the experience journal. So I essentially do that in Remnote. It has almost like a diary feature. It's almost like going back to your teenage years, you know, where I have there's a new note for today. It throws the date and the time and everything onto it. And then I do all of my kind of unstructured note taking in Remnote. That I then use to have a really quick reference for my own personal mental notes, you know. So this is kind of where I work personally. And that's where I will go if I want to find, okay, you know, 6 weeks ago, I talked about this thing. So I'll then be able to link on, okay, I clicked on this. So, and then I have, okay, that word was mentioned in 73 different notes, and I can go, okay, 4 months ago, I talked about it in a meeting, and then I'll see my notes there. So I use Remnote really for my unstructured personal notes. What I then do is I also have Notion, notion.so. Notion I use for my structured notes. This is where I do my meeting minutes, my project management, my task management, my playbooks, my processes. Notion is really great at kind of having really structured very almost like standard operating procedure style documentation, rather than kind of the more unstructured notes that RemNote is great for. Notion is great for that kind of really structured, this is what I'm showing to other people. You know, I will share them my meeting minutes that I've scratched into RemNote. I then transcribe them into Notion, and then I will share them from Notion. So I kind of use those two in combination with each other. I am personally a very visual communicator. You will even see, you know, just out of camera here, I have a whiteboard. I am trying to move away from my physical whiteboard onto a tool called Whimsical. I don't know the exact spelling, so I'll post it later. So I use Whimsical also for flowcharts and process mapping, and, you know, the more kind of graphical, I want to show a process and how we get to a specific endpoint. You know, I use Whimsical for that, and Whimsical integrates super well with Notion. So I'm able to do a flowchart in Whimsical and embed it into a Notion page so that, you know, from a reader's perspective, it's all very seamless. So that's kind of my stack of three that I would use on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's great. Really, really good. And we use Notion a lot in Grow Remote as well. And it's kind of thing where it just, the deeper you go, the more useful it is. And it's so, I'm sure they're updating it, and they're making it better all the time, such as the growth of users and the growth of remote work. So it's the kind of thing where if you get into it now, it will, you know, probably be just as important as Gmail, or just as important as these other like critical tools. That
and just to Ken's point in the chat, I use Notepad++ for years. So I actually went from a physical notepad to Notepad++ to RemNote. That was kind of my journey over the years. The big thing that really pushed me to go from Notepad++ to RemNote was the searchability and the ability to link between notes. So like, I think by the end I had a Notepad++ that probably had 200,000 lines in it. And when you want to find something that you talked about, you know, 6 months ago, and it had, you can only remember one keyword and it mightn't even be spelled right, that's where it kind of fell apart for me, and I wanted something more structured. So that's how I ended up with RemNote.
Brilliant. Yeah. And again, this is your lived experience, having done this for so long. I mean, a lot of people would have just started in March 2020. So that's 2 years ago. So there's, for the majority of people, it's 2 years experience. Whereas when we're talking with remote first companies, we're talking with people who are remote for their, you know, the latter part of their careers, for a decade, for even longer. These are the people that Grow Remote is learning from every day. And that's why we're trying to pass this knowledge on. So really appreciate you sharing, James. It's brilliant to have that experience, and that even just what you're saying, you used to use a particular tool and you've moved on to another one. Like there's so much learning in that, and even just the recommendations that come, because each of these tools, for someone who doesn't understand, they seem all quite similar, but how you use them is so intuitive that, you know, it's just worth practicing and just trying out, and you will pick the ones that suit you. But again, these are the kind of things that you can drop into an interview, or even into a CV or application if you're applying for something. You know, knowledge of Notion, knowledge of Notepad, and these things are what help you in your discussions with employers.
Yeah, exactly. And no, I'm personally very happy to share, you know, any of that knowledge. You'll find I'm quite active on the Grow Remote Slack. You know, feel free to ping me with questions there. And, you know, as we spoke about earlier, if the Grow Remote team wants to set up a kind of a AV and tech channel on Slack, I'm happy to also give some feedback on, you know, what is good value for money in terms of investing into the home office setup as well, from a tools and technology perspective.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that actually would be really, really useful. And I think somewhere for people to share and people to give advice would be really good. And I've noticed on Slack,
I'll take a photo that actually shows you everything that's around me as well, and you'll get a feel for why I say it looks like a TV studio.
Nice one. Good stuff. And yeah, I've noticed on Slack, James, anytime I message you, it's a matter of seconds before you're back to me. So
I live in Slack.
Good stuff. Well, here, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining. This video, we'll be uploading it to YouTube this evening. So it should be available tomorrow or Friday at the very latest. We'll share it in the Slack. Make sure that you're on the Slack. If not, we've put the the link in there. We've put it in again. And please, if you would just take 45 seconds and fill out this survey that we have there, and that'll just help us going forward for future events. And hopefully we can learn more from the community. James is a Slack member of the Grow Remote community, a remote worker. And we're delighted that he's shared his wisdom and his experience this evening. So thanks again to everybody for coming, and thank you, James, for giving your time.
No, thanks for the opportunity, and I hope I'll speak to everybody on Slack.
Yeah, lovely.
Have a good evening.
All right, thanks, guys. Have a lovely evening. Enjoy your dinner or whatever you're having. And thank you. John says thanks. Anya, thanks very much. Carla says thank you, very helpful. Kristen, thank you. Grania says thanks, James. And Shane, thank you both. All right, thanks a million, everybody. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Have a nice evening. Ciao.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, James.
See ya. Cheers.